Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. When we last left Frank and Joe and their father, they had been tied up by the smugglers and were awaiting being forced into Li Chang's boat, bound for China. Things look very grim for our heroes. How can they possibly escape and see the smugglers come to justice? Here is the thrilling conclusion of the Hardy Boys in the House on the Cliff. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in the House on the Cliff. Chapter 21. Quick Work. The Hardy Boys glanced over at their father on the cot. To their surprise, they saw that he was smiling. Frank was on the point of asking him what he found in the situation to smile at, when he caught a warning glance. He looked over at the guard. Malloy was not bothering with the prisoners. He was not even looking in their direction. Instead, his head was already beginning to nod, as though he were going to sleep. Snackley had made a poor selection when he chose Malloy as guard. The man had been up the entire previous night, helping bring in the shipment of smuggled goods from Li Chang's vessel, and he had had no sleep that day. He was very tired. Sleep stole upon him without his being aware of it. Several times he straightened up and rubbed his eyes, but eventually he would bow his head again and give in to the luxury of a little doze. In the meantime, Mr. Hardy was busy. He had profited by his previous experience. When the smugglers seized him and attempted to tie him to the bed for the second time, he had made use of a trick frequently employed by magicians and professional escape artists who guarantee to escape from ropes and straitjackets. He had expanded his chest and held his muscles rigid, keeping his arms as far away from his sides as possible, so that later, when he relaxed, he found that the ropes did not bind him as tightly as his captors had intended. This gave him a small leeway. He found that the ropes were especially slack about his right wrist, so he began to work laboriously to free himself. For a long time he thought it would be impossible, and the rope chafed his wrist. But at last he managed to slide his hand free. Joe and Frank watched this performance with amazement, and new hope came into their eyes as they saw their father slowly groping for one of the knots. The detective fumbled at it for a while. It was slow work, for he had but one hand free, but in their haste the smugglers had not tied the knot as firmly as they should, and before long Fenton Hardy had loosened it to such an extent that soon the ends of the rope fell away. His arms were now free, so he braced himself against the sides of the bed and struggled to release his feet. They had not been bound so securely, being simply tied down under one strand of rope about the cot, and after silently struggling for a few minutes, he was able to work his way free. The detective's next move was to take off his boots, which he did swiftly and quietly, placing them noiselessly on the bed. Then he crept out onto the floor and began to steal over toward the guard. Malloy was half asleep, but the detective had not gone more than 2 yards before a slight sound, a slight creaking of the floor, warned the guard that something was amiss. He turned, blinking. A look of intense amazement crossed Malloy's face, and he opened his mouth to yell for help. But Fenton Hardy leaped across the intervening space and hurled himself upon the smuggler before the guard had time to utter more than a muffled gasp. He clapped one hand over Malloy's mouth and bore the guard to the floor, where they rolled over and over in a desperate and silent struggle. Although Fenton Hardy was weakened by his imprisonment and privation, and although the smuggler was strong and wiry, the detective had the advantage of a surprise attack, and Malloy had no time to collect his faculties. Joe and Frank watched the battle in an agony of suspense. It was, they knew, their last hope. Fenton Hardy still kept his hand over the other man's mouth, although Malloy was gasping and gurgling and making frantic efforts to call out for help. The detective dug his knee into Malloy's stomach, and when the smuggler tried to wriggle out of the way, he snatched for the revolver. Their hands closed about the butt of the weapon at the same instant. The struggle was short and bitter. Malloy tugged at the revolver, trying to draw it from his pocket. Fenton Hardy dug his knee sharply against the man, and Malloy loosened his grasp with a groan of pain. The detective snatched the revolver free and then flung himself back, leveling the weapon at Malloy. "Not a word out of you," he whispered. Malloy's hands rose in the air. He did not utter a sound. He was sitting helplessly on the floor, his mouth opening and closing as he painfully drew breath. He was beaten. The detective spied a knife in a leather sheath at the smuggler's belt, so he reached forward and seized the weapon. Then, still keeping Malloy covered with the revolver, he walked slowly backward until he reached Joe's side. Without removing his eyes from the smuggler, Fenton Hardy bent down and sliced at the ropes that bound his son. The knife was sharp, and the ropes soon fell apart. Joe leaped from the chair, casting aside the rope ends, and took the proffered knife. Then, while his father still covered Malloy, he went over to Frank and set him free. Still without saying a word, Fenton Hardy motioned toward the bed and indicated by signs that the smuggler was to lie down on the cot. A gesture of refusal on the part of Malloy was met by a vigorous forward thrust of the revolver, and the smuggler hastily retreated. The ropes on the bed had not been cut, so they were still available for trussing up Malloy, just as Mr. Hardy had been bound. The boys did the job with neatness and dispatch, and they even gagged the smuggler with his own handkerchief and one of the ropes from the chairs. Within 5 minutes, their erstwhile guard was lying helpless on the bed, bound hand and foot, and gagged so firmly that only a muffled and subdued muttering escaped him. "What now?" asked Frank in a low tone. "We can't go out by the cove," replied his father. "There are 2 men down there now signaling to the motorboat. We'd better go upstairs." "Where does that lead to?" "Outside. It will bring us into the shed near the house." Fenton Hardy moved over toward the door. "We haven't any time to lose," he said. "I have the revolver if we meet anyone." He opened the door cautiously and peeped out. There was no one beyond. There was nothing but a flight of steps leading upward into darkness. The detective went forward, his sons following close at his heels. Step by step, they made their way up in the darkness, for Joe had closed the door behind them, and Frank did not dare make use of the flashlight. At last, Fenton Hardy came to a stop. He was fumbling at something immediately above. Then the boys saw a faint opening, which grew larger above them, and resolved itself into a square of gray light, against which the head and shoulders of their father were fully silhouetted. Fenton Hardy had raised the trapdoor that concealed the entrance to the underground caves and passages. Mr. Hardy looked out carefully. There was no sign of the smugglers. He proceeded to the very top of the steps, then moved clear of the stairway. Frank and Joe followed, rising out of the ground like mysterious spirits of the earth, and the 3 stood in the shelter of the shed. It was a dark night, and the trees were moaning in the wind from the sea. Immediately before them rose the gloomy mass of the house on the cliff. There were no lights. In the direction of the lane, they could hear dull sounds, no doubt from the truck, that the smugglers were loading with goods, which were to be disposed of by the man called Burke. "Safe so far," whispered the detective to his sons. They moved out of the shed, after closing the trap door, and stood in the shadows. "We can't go by way of the lane," whispered Frank. "There's a prisoner in the cellar of that house," said Fenton Hardy. "I hate to go without setting him free." "A prisoner?" "I heard them talking about him." "Why can't we go to town for help?" "Once they find us gone, they'll clear out." "But 3 of us can't do much against this gang. They'll just capture us all again." The detective considered this for a moment. At last he sighed. "Yes, the risk is too great," he said, "and I've let you take too many risks already. We'd better go back to town." Having arrived at this decision, they moved slowly across the grass of the yard, heading toward the bushes that flanked the lane. The great bulk of the old stone house loomed heavily and darkly in the night. Then, suddenly, they heard a harsh sound that struck terror into their hearts. The clatter of the trap door being raised. Chapter 22. Into the Haunted House. A hoarse shout came through the darkness. "Chief! Redhead! They've got away! Watch for them!" Someone was scrambling through the opening in the shed, bellowing in a frantic voice, warning the other smugglers of the escape. "Into the house," snapped Fenton Hardy. He began to run swiftly across the yard toward the big, gloomy house. Frank and Joe followed. The man in the shed saw the moving figures. The darkness was pierced by a flash of crimson, and a revolver barked 3 times. From the lane came the sound of running feet. A man was shouting, "What is it? What's the matter?" "They've got away! Hardy and them boys! They've escaped! Look! There they are now, running across the yard!" The revolver spoke again, but the shots were wild, for the detective and his sons were soon lost to view in the shadows of the house. With the uproar growing in volume behind them, they fled for the shelter of the building. It was their only refuge. If they attempted to escape to the road, they would be almost certain of meeting some of the smugglers. They could not go back down the passageway. If they retreated, they would be driven to the verge of the cliff. Fenton Hardy sped around to the back door and flung it open. The fugitives raced into the kitchen and closed the door behind them. Out of the darkness came a frightened voice. "Who's there?" It was so sudden and unexpected that their pulses leapt. They made no answer. "Who's there? I say, is it you, Redhead?" Still they did not reply. Fenton Hardy crept through the darkness in the direction of the voice. "Speak, quick! Speak, or I'll fire!" The boys heard a sudden scrambling sound. Their father had thrown himself upon the other man. The boys rushed in on the 2 struggling figures. There was a deafening roar and a streak of flame. The man of the house had been armed with a shotgun, and in the struggle it had exploded. Fortunately, the Hardy boys were not standing in the path of the shot, but the noise had attracted the attention of the smugglers outside the house, and in a few seconds the back door was flung open. "They're in here!" someone yelled. "They're in the house!" Fenton Hardy flung to one side the man with whom he had been struggling. "Upstairs!" he called out to his 2 boys, and ran on into the next room. A feeble light was burning, a candle standing in its own grease near the bottom of the staircase. Up these stairs they fled, Joe pausing long enough to extinguish the candle. The room was plunged into darkness, just as the first of the smugglers rushed through the doorway. Fenton Hardy waited at the top of the stairs until the boys joined him. Somebody in the room below lit a match. The detective fired directly at the sputtering light. There was a muffled exclamation. The match was immediately extinguished by the smuggler, who had been so incautious as to reveal his whereabouts in this manner. A whispered conversation followed. "He's at the top of the stairs," said one of the smugglers. "We can't rush him. He's got a revolver." "Only one?" "Yes, the kids aren't armed." "Wait till he uses up his ammunition. Then we'll get him." There was another whispered colloquy, and then the smugglers apparently withdrew toward the doorway leading into the kitchen. Then, in a moment, a perfect cacophony of shots broke out. But Fenton, Hardy, and the boys had withdrawn past the turn in the staircase and were well protected. They could hear the uproar of gunfire as the smugglers riddled the staircase with bullets. "That should have finished 'em," they could hear Snackley saying. "If they're on the stairs at all, they're as dead as mutton by now." "Best be careful," muttered one of the men. "Hardy has a gun." "Where did he get it?" "From the guard. They tied him up." "Lucky they didn't get away altogether. Wait till I talk to Malloy." "He was tied fast to the bed when we came back up the stairs. They'd taken his gun and gagged him. He said they had just gone, so we made after them and came up through the trap door. They were just getting out of the shed when we saw them. What a fine chase we would have had if they had got out into the woods. Well, we have 'em trapped now." Whispers followed. The boys listened. They heard someone say, "The back stairs." Frank turned to his father. "They're going to rush us by the back stairs." "I hadn't thought of that," said Mr. Hardy. "I wonder if there's any way of reaching the attic." Frank took the flashlight from his pocket and switched it on. Just a few yards away, he could distinguish a flight of stairs leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. At the same time, he could hear a stealthy noise at the bottom of another flight of steps that led to the kitchen. "Hurry!" he whispered, and the three moved silently down the hall until they reached the steps. Joe went up first, and Frank followed with the light, while Fenton Hardy stood at the bottom of the steps to cover their retreat with the revolver. When Joe reached the trapdoor, he pushed at it. At first it proved stubborn and would not open. There was an anxious moment while he strove to force it open, but in spite of all his efforts it would not budge. "What's the matter?" asked Frank from below. "It won't open." Frank went on up the few remaining steps and added his efforts to those of his brother. Together they shoved at the trapdoor, and at last it moved, then opened, falling back with a loud crash. There was a yell from the stairs. "Hurry up, men! They're getting into the attic!" A rush of thudding footsteps followed as the smugglers raced up the steps. Joe scrambled through the opening, and Frank followed. Fenton Hardy was only halfway up the steps, however, when the first smugglers reached the hallway. The detective fired directly at them. The smugglers who were in the lead fell back in a desperate attempt to reach cover, and in so doing, they collided with those behind. For a few moments, confusion prevailed, and Fenton Hardy took the advantage of it to spring up the few remaining steps, scramble through the opening, and fling the trapdoor back into place. The Hardys found themselves in the inky darkness of the attic. Frank switched on the flashlight, and in its glare, they saw that they were in a dusty chamber immediately below the roof. Old boxes and rubbish lay about. "Where did they go?" they heard one of the smugglers ask. "Into the attic," replied another. "Now we've got 'em where we want 'em." "That's what you said last time." "They can't get out of there. We've got 'em cornered." Snackley's voice broke in. "Hardy!" he shouted. Mr. Hardy did not answer. "Listen, Hardy," went on Snackley. "We'll give you 1 minute to come down out of there." Still no answer. "The floors are thin, Hardy. We can fire right through 'em. You can't get out. We have you cornered. Better come down." Frank flashed the light from side to side. It was evident that the smugglers spoke the truth. They were indeed cornered. An interval of silence followed. Then came, "Your last chance, Hardy." Frank flashed the light upon his father. Mr. Hardy was inspecting the chamber of the revolver. He held out the weapon with a gesture of despair. There were no more shells. A shot sounded from below, and a bullet ripped its way savagely through the flooring but a foot or so away from where the three sat. Another bullet tore through the wood of the trapdoor. The Hardys sprang back, and making as little noise as possible, pressed themselves against the sloping walls of the attic, keeping as far away from the trapdoor as they could. A few more shots resounded. The bullets were unpleasantly close. Then Snackly spoke again. "What do you think of it now, Hardy? Are you and your boys ready to come down?" They did not answer, for they knew that if they did, their voices would reveal where they were standing and might bring a bullet. When they did not reply, Snackly spoke to his men. "Let 'em have a few more." An angry chorus of revolver shots followed. In the midst of the uproar, some of the smugglers secured a long pole and pushed against the trapdoor with it. Before those above could avert the danger, the trapdoor was flung wide open. It fell back with a crash. A hand appeared through the trapdoor, holding a revolver, and then the head and shoulders of one of the smugglers followed. He peered into the darkness, holding the weapon in readiness. Someone had switched on a light in the hall, so that the man's figure could be clearly seen. "Come out of it," he snapped, pointing the revolver directly at the dim figure of Frank. "Come out of it, or I'll shoot." Further resistance was useless. With a sinking heart, Frank advanced toward the edge of the opening in the floor, while Joe and Fenton Hardy followed, with arms upraised. The smuggler backed his way down the stairs, still keeping them covered, until he reached the bottom of the stairs. The Hardys descended, conscious of an array of leveled revolvers that covered every movement. They saw Snackly standing in the forefront of the crowd. They were captured again. Chapter 23. Rescue. Snackly stepped forward. "So," he sneered, "you pretty nearly got away with it, didn't you?" The captives did not answer. They were sick with disappointment. Just when escape had been within their grasp, the smugglers had outwitted them. "You bit off a little more than you could chew when you stacked up against me," bragged Snackly. "What'll we do with him, Chief?" asked one of the men. "Take him back to the cave. We'll get him out to Li Chang right away. If they get away again, there'll be trouble for you. Keep an eye on 'em." "Shouldn't we tie him up?" "There's no rope. It doesn't matter. Put a bullet through the first one that makes a false move. You hear that?" he said, turning to Fenton Hardy. "The first one that tries to escape gets a bullet through him." The three were surrounded by the smugglers. The light shone on their evil, bearded faces and glittered on the drawn revolvers. Fenton Hardy's useless weapon had been snatched from him. "Downstairs," snapped Snackly. "Get downstairs with you." He prodded Frank with the barrel of his revolver as he spoke. The Hardy boys moved toward the stairs, their father in the rear. One of the smugglers went ahead in case the prisoners should by chance make some desperate break for freedom. When they reached the lower room, they paused, while the man ahead lit a match. The electric light had been broken. Hardly had the match flared than there came the sound of thudding feet through the kitchen, and the back door banged noisily. Someone rushed into the room, gasping for breath. The light revealed him to be another of the smugglers. "Police!" he exclaimed in terror. "They're coming down the lane!" A babble of voices followed. The smugglers came tumbling down the stairs in their haste. With one bound, Snackly leaped forward and seized the man by the collar. "What?" he exclaimed. "What's that you say? Police?" "Down the lane," gasped the man. "They came down the road in a car, and they're closing in on the house. I saw them." With a yell, Snackly flung the man to one side. "Down into the cave!" he roared. "Quick!" Confusion prevailed. In the resulting uproar, the match went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Frank resolved on a daring move. He was standing directly beside one of the smugglers, and as soon as the light went out, he sprang at the fellow. Dashing the revolver from his grasp, it clattered on the floor. "Help!" roared the fellow as they grappled together. Fenton Hardy had also been watching for his chance, and he sprang through the darkness at Snackley. He collided heavily with the chief of the smugglers, and they rolled on the floor in a desperate struggle. It was impossible to distinguish friend from enemy in the darkness. Joe plunged into the midst of the surging figures, and his fist smashed against the face of one of the smugglers, who gave a howl of pain. Then outside another uproar burst forth. Someone was banging on the front door. Men could be heard shouting to one another. Snackley made a desperate effort and managed to get to his feet. He struck out with both fists and managed to break free from the detective. He whirled to one side, stumbled out into the kitchen, and then reached the back door. He flung the door open. Almost instantly, a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was the figure of a man in the uniform of a state trooper with drawn revolver, and Snackley shouted the warning to the smugglers in the other room. "The police!" he roared. "Every man for himself! Make your getaway!" The trooper shot through the doorway at him, but Snackley dodged to one side. There was a rush of footsteps from the other room as the rest of the smugglers raced out into the kitchen. The officer tried to hold them back, but they were too many for him, and he was hurled against the wall. Utter confusion prevailed. The place was in absolute darkness, and out in the yard, shots, shouts, and hoarse imprecations mingled in an indescribable uproar. One of the smugglers managed to reach the shed. He flung open the trapdoor and descended the steps. Some of his companions followed, and in the darkness and excitement, their escape was unnoticed. Half a dozen police officers were out in the yard. They had been attracted to the house by the sound of the shots when the Hardys were pursued by the smugglers, and they had planned to surround the place. They would have succeeded in capturing the entire gang if it had not been for the man on guard outside. Back in the living room of the house, Frank was still struggling with his antagonist. The man was strong and heavy, a rough-and-tumble fighter, and the boy soon found that he had his hands full. They struggled desperately in the darkness, the smuggler frantic with the fear of capture. Frank grimly resolved that the man should not get away. Fenton Hardy headed toward the door leading into the kitchen. Just then a figure brushed by him. He made a grasp for the man, but the fellow evaded him and raced toward the other side of the room. The detective gave chase. The fugitive kicked open a door and ran toward the front of the house. Mr. Hardy could follow him quite easily by the sound of his footsteps. The fugitive scurried into a front room and banged the door behind him. Mr. Hardy launched himself against the door, which had a lock that snapped when the door shut. For a moment he was balked. Then he stepped back a few paces and rushed at the door, plunging against it with his shoulder. The woodwork splintered. Another rush, and the door fell open. The detective reeled into the room. His fugitive had disappeared. But the room was faintly lighted as there was a wide window, and in the gloom the detective could see a dark patch on the floor. It was a trap door, leading evidently to the cellar. He went down through the opening, finding a flight of stairs which he descended. He could hear the footsteps receding through the darkness, but he made his way across the uneven floor of the cellar. The detective stopped and listened. He heard the hurrying footsteps as the smuggler went on to the far end of the cellar. Then, to his great surprise, he heard a voice. In the distance he saw a faint glow of light. Then he saw that the cellar was divided into two parts, and that the fugitive had entered a small room. He crept closer. "What's happening?" he heard someone say in a weak voice. "Everything," snarled a voice, which he recognized as that of Snackley. The detective's heart leaped. "Everything is happening," The police are here." "The police?" "Yes, the police. State troopers, federal officers and all. But don't think you're going to have a chance of squealing on us. I'm going to fix you, as I should have done a long while ago." The other voice rose, replete with terror. "No, no, you won't do that, Snockley. Let me live." Fenton Hardy crept swiftly over to the door. He saw Snackley standing by a small cot in a cell-like room. On the cot crouched a haggard man whose hands were handcuffed behind him. His feet were shackled to one leg of the iron cot. Snackley, with a grim look of cruelty on his face, was raising a heavy club he had picked up. There was no time to lose. The detective sprang through the doorway. He plunged at Snackley just as the smuggler raised the club to strike. Snackley reeled against the wall, with Fenton Hardy at his throat. Desperately, the smuggler tried to raise the weapon, but the detective had seized his wrist. They swayed to and fro, stumbling about on the muddy floor. Mr. Hardy had the advantage, in that he had taken Snackley by surprise. He pinned the smuggler against the wall, twisting his wrist. The club fell to the floor. Snackley plunged forward and they lost their footing, rolling about in the mud. Suddenly, Fenton Hardy wrenched his arm free, sprawled over, and managed to seize Snackley's revolver. He pressed it against Snackley's side. The smuggler gave in. He flung his hands above his head. "I'm licked," he muttered sullenly. They got slowly to their feet, Fenton Hardy keeping a watchful eye on the captive. Upstairs, they could hear the uproar continuing, as the police still gave battle to the smugglers. "Upstairs," snapped the detective curtly. Without taking his eyes off Snackley, he said to the man on the cot, "We'll come back for you later, Mr. Jones." Chapter 24. The Roundup. The Hardy boys, in the meantime, were in the thick of the struggle. Frank fought desperately with the smuggler he had assailed in the living room of the house, while Joe raced across the yard toward the trapdoor leading to the underground caves. He found that although 3 of the smugglers had been captured by the officers in the yard, and that as many more were fighting to escape, none of the police had as yet learned of the trapdoor down which some of the men had disappeared. With a shout to a nearby officer, who had just succeeded in clapping the handcuffs on one of the smugglers, Joe made his way down the stairs. He heard the officer running over to the edge of the trap, and saw the gleam of the flashlight. "Some of them got out this way," Joe shouted back to the officer. The man called to one of his companions, and then footsteps clattered on the stairs as Joe went on. He reached the door that opened into the chamber where his father had been a prisoner. But on entering the room he found it empty. There were evidences of hasty flight, and the door on the far side of the room was wide open. "Secret passages, eh?" exclaimed one of the officers as he came into the room. He was a state trooper in uniform. Joe led the way out through the opposite door and down the stairs that led toward the bottom of the cliff. The trooper who had spoken illuminated the way with his flashlight, and they clattered on down the stairs until they reached the storage room. Here, everything was in confusion. The escaping smugglers had evidently endeavored to take with them what goods they could, probably the smaller packages containing drugs, for boxes and parcels were overturned and strewn about the floor. "You seem to know this place pretty well," said one of the troopers, as Joe led the way across to the opposite door and stepped out onto the landing. "I've been here before," he answered. "There's a water cave below this passage. They've probably made their getaway in the boat." They hastened down to the passageway and came at last to the cave. As Joe had expected, the boat was gone. "They got away," he said in disappointment, as the trooper turned the flashlight onto the channel between the rocks. There was a shout from the darkness of the cove. "Give us a light!" they heard. Joe gave a shout of joy. It was Tony Preto's voice. Then Joe and the troopers with him heard the steady beat of a motorboat. Joe seized the flashlight and ran out along the path leading to the entrance of the cave. The motorboat was not many yards away. Tony had been searching for the channel. "Right this way," Joe called out. "Head toward the right of the cave and you'll be in the deep water. A little further. Good." As the motorboat drew nearer, he saw that it was filled with men, and that a rowboat was being towed behind. "We got 'em!" cried Tony exultantly. "They were just getting out of the cove in the boat when we came up." "Who is with you?" asked Joe. "Police. The rest of them went up the shore road in a car." "We've caught the whole gang, then. They raided the house and got the rest of the smugglers. We thought these fellows had made a getaway." "Ah, no chance, although it was mighty close. They pretty nearly slipped out of the cove right under our noses." The boat came to a stop beside the natural wharf of rock. One or two of the officers, revolvers in hand, clambered out. 3 of the smugglers had been captured while trying to escape from the cove in a rowboat. "If they'd got out, we never would have caught 'em," said Joe. "They were heading out toward a ship." "A ship?" exclaimed one of the officers, a burly man in plain clothes. He stepped forward. "Did they say anything about a ship?" "A man named Li Chang has a ship lying in wait outside the bay," said Joe. "I heard them talking about it." "Good!" exclaimed the burly man. "Now we'll capture the whole outfit." He turned to Tony. "I suppose your boat is good for another little run?" "I'll say it is, sir." "I want as many officers as we can spare," said the burly man. "We'll go out and find that ship. Li Chang, did you say?" he added, turning to Joe. "That was the name." "I know that ship. We've been trying to catch that villain for years. Darst, go on up and see how the rest of the men made out at the house on the cliff, and take as many officers as they can spare. There's a passage up through the rocks, I take it." "Regular staircase all the way, sir," remarked Darst, one of the raiding officers. "Good. Don't lose any time." The 3 smugglers were taken out of the boat and handcuffed, then escorted up the stairs, while the burly man, who was the chief of a squad of federal agents, undertaking a drive against the smugglers on that part of the coast, remained with the motorboat. Within a short time, Darst returned with 3 more officers. He reported that a clean sweep had been made at the house. "They have 'em all handcuffed and sitting in the kitchen," he said. "Mr. Hardy got Snackly." "Snackly?" exclaimed the federal man. "It's his gang?" "Yes, sir. He got Snackly in the cellar. One of his sons tackled Redhead Blount, one of Snackly's sidekicks, and held him down until the police came in. When we brought our 3 in, that finished the roundup." "It does, so far. We're going out and grab Li Chang from that ship, and that'll clean everything up." The officers got into the motorboat, and Joe clambered in beside Tony Preto, who was at the wheel. The craft backed out of the channel into the deeper water of the cove, then sped out into Barmet Bay. "Once we get out of the bay, we should see her lights," said the federal officer. "Li Chang probably has a ship anchored just off the coast." This proved to be the case. The lights of the vessel were soon descried, and the motorboat sped toward it through the night. When the boat drew alongside, the federal man roared out, "Ahoy there! Throw a ladder over or we'll open fire on you." "Who's there?" "The police." Angry voices and running footsteps suddenly created a commotion. One of the troopers fired his revolver into the air, and very promptly a ladder was lowered over the side of the vessel. "That's better," said the federal man as he clambered up over the rail, revolver in hand. "I'll just talk to your skipper for a minute." The capture of Li Chang was without incident. When he was told that Snackly and the gang were captured, Li Chang, who was a small, wizened little fellow with a villainous countenance, blandly submitted to arrest and consented to be taken ashore. There were only 2 or 3 members of the crew aboard, the others having shore leave. So 2 of the Federal men were left in charge of the ship until relief could be sent from Bayport, and the motorboat made its way back to the cove. The roundup was complete. Snackley's smuggling gang had been completely broken up. Chapter 25. The Mystery Explained. The Hardy Boys were the heroes of Bayport when the news of the capture of Snackley and his men spread throughout the city the next day. As for Tony Preto, he was the envy of all the chums of the 2 lads. "Tony had all the luck," bemoaned Chet Morton, as the boys were all sitting in the barn, back of the Hardy home the next afternoon. This barn, which had been fitted up as a gymnasium, was a meeting place for the lads on occasions of importance. "We had to have a motorboat," said Frank. "Believe me, I was wishing more than once that the whole crowd was along." "And you'll get the reward for capturing Snackley?" asked Phil Cohen. "Not all of it. Dad gets half. Joe and I split the rest." "You haven't any kick coming. What's going to happen to Snackley?" "He'll probably go to the electric chair," answered Frank soberly. "Why?" "He murdered Felix Palooka, the miser." "Murdered him?" "Yes. Dad found that out in his investigations. Dad suspected all along that there was some connection between Snackley and the house on the cliff, especially when he found that Snackley and Palooka had been related. He went to find out what he could, but the smugglers saw him and captured him." "What about that fellow they'd imprisoned in the cellar?" questioned Biff Hooper. "Didn't you say Snackley was just going to kill him when your father saved him?" "That was the young fellow we saved in the bay that day. The young chap who told us his name was Jones. It wasn't his real name at all. His name is Yates, and he was one of the smugglers." "Why was Snackley chasing him that day?" asked Perry Robinson. "It seems that Yates got angry because he didn't get his full share of the money from the last smuggling trip, so he threatened to tell the police on Snackley. The smugglers locked him up, but he got away in one of the motorboats, so they chased him and ran him down. They thought to have killed him in the explosion or else drown him, but Joe and I managed to bring him ashore. We left him at the Kane farmhouse, but the smugglers came along next day and kidnapped him. They kept him prisoner in the cellar of the Palooka house after that. I still can't understand about those yells and shrieks we heard the first day we were out at the farmhouse," put in Phil Cohen. That was just to frighten us away. One of the men in the gang is sort of crazy, and they had him posted there to frighten people off by yelling and shrieking whenever anyone showed up around the place. He was the chap who stole our tools from the motorcycles," explained Frank. "But after our visit there," added Joe, "they thought it was too dangerous, and there might be an investigation. So they put Redhead and his wife and one of their men there, to pose as renters of the place." "So there weren't any ghosts after all!" exclaimed Jerry Gilroy. "Nary a ghost," laughed Frank. "Snackley explained everything this morning in a confession. The whole gang is locked up, even to Li Chang. Yates, the young fellow they'd kept prisoner so long, told the whole story first. He's turned state's evidence, and told how long the smuggling had been going on, how Snackley had made use of the house on the cliff after killing Palooka, how he fixed up the tunnels in the cliff. He told everything. It seems that Palooka had the smuggling idea in the first place, and he spent years fixing up those caves and tunnels. When everything was ready, he called in Snackley. But Snackley didn't like to share with anyone who had a right to a voice in the affair, so he killed the old man, took his money, and brought the smuggling gang in there." "Yates told all that?" "He told so much of it that Snackley saw there was no use bluffing any longer. So he admitted the whole story." "Gosh," sighed Chet. "Just my luck. I was there in time to get scared to death by that crazy person, and there in time to get bawled out and chased off the farm by Redhead and his wife, but I missed out on all the fun at the last." "Not much fun about it," declared Joe. "It didn't seem funny to us when the smugglers caught us in the cave, just as we were getting Dad free." "And it wasn't any fun hiding in that attic, with the bullets coming through the floor 19 to the dozen," added Frank. I thought every minute was going to be my last." "No, I guess it wasn't any too funny then," admitted Chet. "You deserve every cent you get out of the reward." "We'll treat the whole gang to a feed as soon as we collect," Joe promised. "Whoo!" shouted Chet, turning a handspring. "Now you're talking." The Hardy Boys kept their word. Soon after they had received their share of the reward, which was presented to them with many glowing words and congratulations from the federal authorities, who had long been trying to put Snackley behind the bars, they gave a dinner in the barn that eclipsed any similar feed in the history of Bayport. "I hope the Hardy Boys solve a mystery every week," said Chet, as he confronted his third dish of ice cream, "and I hope they celebrate every success the same way." The Hardy Boys were not destined to solve a mystery every week, but it was not long before they were plunged into a maze of events, which were fully as exciting as those which led to the finding of the Tower treasure, and those that followed their first visit to the house on the cliff. The story of their adventures will be told in the next volume of this series called The Hardy Boys in the Secret of the Old Mill. Tony Preto, conscious of the envying glances of the other lads, because he had participated in the eventful climax to the mystery of the house on the cliff, scooped up the last of his ice cream and said, "Once I wanted my father to buy an automobile, and he bought a motorboat instead. Now he wants to sell the boat and buy an automobile. Just let him try it. That boat gave me more fun in one day than I'd ever had since we came to the States." The end. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we begin a new book. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.